Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating, a comprehensive academic systematic review by Heath Rose, Jim McClellan, and Nicola Galloway. We are going to unpack a massive sociolinguistic shift. Specifically, we're looking at the undeniable gap between how the English language is actually taught in schools today versus how it's used out there in the globalized real world. It's an explainer full of paradigm shifts, so let's jump right in.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover 1. Who owns English today? 2. A needed paradigm shift. 3. Training the teachers. 4. Inside the language classroom. And finally, 5. The future of research. Let's get to it.
All right, Section 1. Who owns English today? Let's take a look at the changing landscape. So, who actually owns the English language? I know, it's a pretty provocative question, right? Historically, we've just kind of assumed the answer is obvious, native speakers. But the source material makes a really compelling case that, with our hyper-connected world, English is transformed into a global lingua franca. It's essentially moved from being the property of a small minority of native speakers to a language with truly global ownership. It functions as a bridge for people from incredibly diverse linguistic backgrounds.
For decades, language teaching leaned heavily on this thing called the inner circle model from way back in 1985. It basically defined norm-providing native English-speaking countries as the ultimate gold standard. But the researchers argue this model is just completely outdated now. Because of global mobility, English is used so fluidly across geographic contexts. In fact, so-called native English is actually in minority usage on a global scale today. Multilingualism, that's the new normal.
Now, you might have heard some of these heavy academic acronyms tossed around, like WE for World Englishes or ELF for English as a Lingua Franca. Well, the researchers group all these shared endeavors under one broad, super-inclusive umbrella, Global Englishes. Whether we're talking about World Englishes or English as a Lingua Franca, they all explore the beautifully diverse, fluid ways English is used globally today, and exactly how that impacts TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages.
Moving right along to Section 2, a needed paradigm shift. It's time to talk about innovating TESOL.
This paradigm shift, it's honestly night and day. Traditional English language teaching, it's super focused on these static native speaker norms and monolingual orientations, basically pretending the student's native language doesn't even exist. Global Englishes, on the flip side, actually embraces reality. It focuses on functional usage, it prioritizes mutual intelligibility over absolute grammatical perfection, and it validates a learner's multilingual background. Basically, traditional curricula are entirely misaligned with how English actually functions out there in the wild.
And scholars have been sounding the alarm on this for quite a while now. Just look at this quote from Matsuda and Friedrich in 2012. The linguistic, cultural, and functional diversity associated with English today challenges some of the fundamental assumptions of English language teaching and requires that we revisit our pedagogical practices. This really urgent theoretical call for change is exactly why scholars developed concrete frameworks. They needed a real way to bridge the massive gap between high-level theory and day-to-day classroom practice.
So, to take this from theory down to practical reality, the GELT framework lays out 6 very specific steps. It starts right inside the curriculum, increasing exposure to diverse Englishes and respecting multilingualism, and it extends all the way out to systemic changes, like putting an end to unfair hiring practices that heavily favor native speakers.
Okay, Section 3, training the teachers. Let's look at curriculum innovation.
So, the researchers behind this review screened hundreds of articles published between 2010 and 2020, and they filtered them down to 38 key empirical papers. Notice the breakdown here. 17 focused on language classrooms, 11 on technology, and just 10 on teacher education.
Let's actually zoom in on that number 10 for a second. Out of an entire decade of research, only 10 empirical studies examined curriculum innovation for teachers. Think about that. Despite years of scholars calling for change, actual research on preparing the teachers themselves is shockingly still in its infancy.
When you really synthesize the methodology of these studies, a pretty clear, kind of worrying pattern starts to emerge. We're talking about a huge reliance on tiny sample sizes, like groups of just 10 people, and retrospective qualitative data, basically asking teachers how they felt after a course was already over. Now, there are a few notable exceptions, like AIDSIT et al., which used a longitudinal design with 215 pre-service teachers, but overall, the field desperately needs much more robust research designs to actually prove these interventions work.
Now, you might be asking, why is this specific teacher training so vital?
Well, Ali noted something incredibly powerful back in 2009. On a global level, the ELT profession is perhaps the world's only occupation in which the majority faces discrimination. I mean, wow, that adds immense weight to the data. It really highlights the deeply entrenched native speaker bias that teacher training programs have to actively work to overcome, changing how non-native speaking teachers view their own absolutely vital expertise.
Which brings us to Section 4, Inside the Language Classroom. Let's talk about language interventions.
Shifting gears to the students themselves. 17 of the analyzed studies actually evaluated these global English's innovations being trialed live, right? Inside actual language classrooms. And geographically, these classroom studies literally span the globe. I'm talking Japan, China, the US, Australia, Iran, Turkey, you name it. But there is a significant gap we have to point out. These innovations are almost entirely confined to university settings. There's a glaring lack of representation for younger learners in primary or secondary schools, or really any context outside of traditional higher education.
But, and here comes the reality check from the researchers, even when these interventions happen in classrooms and students show genuinely positive attitudes toward them, massive barriers remain. A deeply entrenched adherence to standard language ideology and native speakerism makes real-world implementation incredibly complex. Teachers often just don't have the proper materials to teach global Englishes, and the broader educational systems, they're still firmly rooted in the old native speaker paradigms.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the future of research, the systemic paradigm shift.
So, what does this all mean? The author's ultimate findings lay out a pretty stark contrast between where we are and where we need to go. The current reality is dominated by cross-sectional designs and short-term pilot programs. But if we want to force a true systemic paradigm shift, we absolutely require longitudinal designs, direct measures of actual classroom effects, and we need to be observing these teachers when they return to their own classrooms.
Which leaves us with one final, absolutely vital question to ponder. Are our language classrooms ready for the real world? The Global Englishes movement is striving to align education with the dynamic, multilingual reality of global communication. But until the curricula, the hiring practices, and the research actually catch up, millions of learners might be preparing for a world that literally no longer exists. Definitely something to think about the next time you hear a quote-unquote standard English accent. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.